Okay, good. Okay, hit the record button. Okay, good evening all, and while I'm at it, let me hit my share screen button. So we'll have all my sources here on. Good evening all. Welcome once again to our regular weekly shiur. That is Li'ilu Nishmat Avi Morido Berber Ben Reuven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bat Arav Michael. And of course, this week we are talking about parshat vayechi, which we conclude the book of Bereshit, the story of the patriarchs and their families. And the parshat vayechi begins with a number of stories about Yaakov's closing chapters. There are actually three. We're going to try to go through two of them tonight, both of which are interactions between Yaakov and Yosef are the primary participants. And the secondary participants in the second half, or the second story, are Menashe and Ephraim, and we're all familiar, I think, with both of those stories, but I wanted to focus on a few interesting aspects of these two stories. The first being Yaakov calling Yosef and basically commanding him to make sure he gets buried back in Eretz Yisrael, not to leave his body in Egypt, make sure he gets buried in Eretz Yisrael. The second is where he brings Menashe and Ephraim and gives them that very famous bracha of B'cha Yivarech Yisrael Lemor Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim Menashe, and the whole story with Yaakov and the way he places his hands over the two sons, which Bez Hashem we're going to get to shortly. Okay, we're going to start with Yaakov's life in Mitzrayim. Yaakov spends the last 17 years of his life, not coincidentally. Yosef spent the first 17 years of his life in Canaan. Yaakov spends the last 17 sort of reciprocal, so that the 17 years Yaakov supported Yosef, Yosef now supports him, setting the precedent that guess what? You only have to not only have to take care of your kids, you may come to a time where you have to take care of your parents. This may be something we all don't want to accept, especially when we're stuck in that so-called sandwich generation. But it's a lesson that Yosef teaches us, that you can't just tell your parents, well, that was nice that you raised me, but you're on your own. If they need your help, you have to be there to help them in any way, whether it's financial support, whether it's emotional support, whether it's taking them here, there, or everywhere. And whatever it is, whatever you can do to help your parents is an important lesson that Yosef wants to teach us. And the Torah feels that it's important enough to mention by mentioning that and encapsulating the fact that Yaakov is living specifically. I think that that correlation of 17 to 17 is really to focus us on that lesson. Again, as I've done in the past couple of weeks, you'll notice that Yaakov and Yisrael are highlighted in different colors. Yaakov and Yisrael, the two names by which Yaakov is referred. And the Torah seems to almost arbitrarily switch back and forth between the names. But the commentaries all try to understand the rationale when we use Yaakov, when we use Yisrael. In this case, in the first story, in story number one, which only has a couple of psukim, we have Yaakov twice, we have Yisrael twice. Perfect balance. But it's interesting that the Yaakov is referring to Yaakov passively. Vayechi Yaakov, Yaakov lived. But in the next two, it's Yaakov is involved, so it's Yisrael. But again, if we look at Pasuk Chavtet, it's very clear that the Yisrael is very much connected to Eretz Yisrael. When Yaakov is speaking about something relating to Eretz Yisrael, at least in this parsha only, clearly Yaakov is in Mitzrayim. Yisrael is, I'm coming home. I don't belong in Mitzrayim. I have to always acknowledge that Mitzrayim is not really my home. It's a temporary place on the journey back to Eretz Yisrael, but Yisrael is my home. And I think that focus is there by the fact that we switch from Yaakov in the first passage when he's talking about him living in Mitzrayim, and Yisrael when he's talking to Yosef about bringing me back to Eretz Yisrael. It's time for me to go home. I think the number one question, by the way, this is a sidelight which we're not going to get into, but it's a great topic for a discussion, is why for 17 years is there no mention of anybody trying to go home? Why doesn't Yaakov say, okay, Yosef, it's nice, I saw you, I'm going back home. I don't live here. Why does he stay in Egypt for 17 years? I don't want to address it tonight, but it's a great question for a future shiur. Anyway, the interesting point here is Yaakov calls Yosef, tells him this very, very, very strange verse. We've seen it once before. There's only one other place that it appears in the entire Tanakh, and that is Eliezer. When Avram is talking to Eliezer about finding a wife for Yitzchak, he has this same phrase, and take an oath to me. Now, Yaakov doesn't say, he just says, he does not say, swear to me. He says in Pasuk Lamed, when I die, please carry me from Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And Yosef's immediate answer in the same pasuk, it doesn't even start a new pasuk. No problem, Dad. You got it. Okay? But Yaakov is not satisfied. Verse 31, Yaakov says, he shavali. There he says that magic word. I want you to swear to me that you'll do it. But Yosef has no problem taking that oath. He does it right away, unhesitantly, again, in the same pasuk. And in that same pasuk, it says, Yaakov is now happy, he's content, he's got the answer he needs, and he's got the reinforcement of the answer. So I just want to bring below again the same concept of here, as David said, by Avram and Eliezer. The interesting, though, that's very different from Yaakov and Yosef, it says, when Eliezer takes the oath, it says he did what he said. He put his, you want me to put my hand on your thigh, put my hand on your thigh, under your thigh, wherever he wanted it. He does it. With Yosef, it doesn't say that Yaakov asked him again to do it. He just says, oh, because he immediately responded, okay, and he didn't press him on where he was placing his hands. Very interesting juxtaposition of the two stories in the way the oath is carried out. Yaakov apparently is happy with Yosef taking an oath without, holding on to anything particular. There's no, doesn't say, oh, here, take the Sefer Torah and hold it. Take this ritual object and hold it. He just says he swears to him and he swears to him. So I think that's interesting, just a juxtaposition. I don't know why the Torah emphasizes in Eliezer's case that where he places his hand when he takes the oath, and in Yosef's it doesn't. But just something to point out. Yeah, you'll notice there's 3 dots at the bottom of the story between when Avram asks him and he actually does it. Yes, there's a huge. So maybe the Torah goes back and says that that's a good. David suggests that perhaps because of the digression in between with the whole discussion between Avram and Eliezer, well, maybe she won't want to come back. What do I do? And that's why it repeats that he did exactly as Avram asked him to do. Jackie has a comment.
Trust between father and son.
You ordinarily, I would say yes. That Jackie, just for those of you on the Zoom who may not have heard it, Jackie suggests that more trust, higher trust love between father and favorite son, not just son. I'm going to add the word favorite to what Jackie said. Then master and servant in Avram's case. However, given the fact that Avram is entrusting him with this rather delicate mission, I don't think there's a lack of trust there. I think Avram is concerned that there will be very significant obstacles placed, and he wants Eliezer. I think in Eliezer's case, the oath is not for Avraham. Avram was sure Eliezer was going to do it. I think and maybe that perhaps is why the Torah emphasizes his willingness to place his hand when he's taking the oath, because I think he's more concerned with giving Eliezer reinforcing it for him when he gets to the family if there's a problem. Whereas in Yosef's case, I don't think Yaakov anticipates any problems on Yosef's part. The problems Yaakov is anticipating are on the Egyptians' part. In other words, Yaakov has become a venerated figure in Egypt, at least according to the Midrash. And therefore Yaakov is afraid that they're not going to let him, and he's going to need this oath to be able to convince Paro, rather than because Yosef won't want to do it. So I don't think in either case the oath is because there was a lack of trust. Although that certainly is a possibility. I think in both cases the oath is taken on is the requester asking the one who's to perform it to take an oath to give them the strength to carry it out. Okay. And I think just to go further with that, there's one other place where we have a very, very similar request in our parsha, right at the end, the last pasuk in the parsha says, "Vayashma Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor." Yosef, when he's on his deathbed, makes a very similar request of not his sons, not his servant, but his brothers, because and it seems, and the Midrash seems to imply that Yosef is, despite the fact that he's the next to youngest, he's the first of the brothers to die. And he makes them take an oath. I know that God's gonna remember you and redeem you, and eventually we're going back home, because this is not home. I know I'll be dead, but bring my coffin back with you. I don't want to be buried permanently here, even though I know I'm going to be stuck here for a while. I'd like to eventually get home. And we know, of course, that Moshe Rabbeinu takes Yosef's bones with him, and ultimately they're buried in Shechem. But it's interesting, it's the same concept of an oath there, because in Yosef's case, I think it's much different, because he is giving an oath not to the people who are going to carry it out, but to the ancestors of the people who are going to carry it out. So it's something that he wants to be remembered and going forward. It's a much different case. Yaakov is telling Yosef, I want it done immediately upon my death. Yosef is telling his brothers, I know you don't have the pull with power to get me back home now, like I had with power to get Abba back home now, but I do want you to make sure I get back home. And that, as I said, that oath does play a significant part, is specifically mentioned when the Jews, as Bnei Yisrael, are leaving in parshat Beshalach, that Moshe is the one who makes sure that Yosef's oath is fulfilled by Bnei Yisrael, at least as far as he can. He can't finish it, and it's very interesting that when Yosef actually does get buried, Moshe doesn't get the credit for it. Moshe gets the credit for taking him, but he doesn't get the credit when he's buried. It says the Atzmot Bnei Yosef Asher Halu Bnei Yisrael Mitzrayim, that the Jews took out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem. Moshe doesn't get credit even for taking him out when they actually get to burial, because he wasn't able to finish the job. Okay. Second story is the story, as we're familiar with, the story of Menashe and Ephraim, and in it there are two flashbacks. So you're going to see a lot of interesting things going on here. I'm going to go back to a couple of flashbacks that Yaakov is going to have, that the Torah is going to record as he is having this dialogue with Yosef. So let's begin. Again, this is chapter 48 in your Chumashim. Again, sometime after he has this conversation with Yosef about burial, it's not the same time. Two different stories, very important, because they're in the same aliyah. They're right next to each other in Torah. We sometimes, when we're studying the parshanim sometimes almost put these two as though they're in the same chapter. They're not. They're in two different chapters. If you look, by the way, I usually try to remember to do this. At the end is, I erased it. There was actually, it is a paragraph break in the Torah. It's a separate paragraph. As a matter of fact, this first story about Yaakov's burial is really part of the parak that is in Vayigash. It's the only parsha in the Torah that doesn't start on a new chapter in the new paragraph in the Torah. And this part where he asked Yosef to bury him in Egypt is really part of Vayigash. But it's not. It's part of vayechi, but it's not. In the Torah, the way the Torah scroll is written, it's almost part of vayechi. Anyway, so this is a new chapter, and the Torah really wants us to understand these are two separate stories. Even though some of the commentators want to intermingle the two, they're not. Okay. Yosef is told his father is ill, and he brings Menashe and Ephraim. Now, Menashe and Ephraim here are going to come to represent Yosef. If we go through all of the travelings in the wilderness, the tribe of Yosef almost disappears. There's the tribe of Menashe, there's the tribe of Ephraim. There's no tribe of Yosef. So you'll notice I try to point it out by the blue by showing that Menashe and Ephraim together basically equal Yosef. That's why I put them in the same color as Yosef, so that we'll focus on them as, even though in this story they are entirely passive, but their tribes are going to be the tribes that carry on Yosef's legacy, not as Yosef, but as Menashe and Ephraim separately. Okay. Okay, so somehow Yosef is told Vayomer li Yosef, Yosef is told, your father is not well. The Mefarshim tell us that Yaakov is the first person in history who has an illness before he dies. We can thank Yaakov for just like we can thank Avram for having signs of old age. We can thank Yaakov, at least according to the Midrash, as having an illness before old age rather than dying suddenly. Up to that point in time, according to the Midrash, people died by basically sneezing and dying. And the Midrash says that because that's how Hashem breathed, the neshamas breathed in through the nostrils. That's how people died. And Yaakov says it's not right because how do you know you're going to die and you don't have time to set your affairs in order? And Yaakov is really the first one who, on his death or as he's dying, quote, sets his affairs in order. And that's really what parshat vayechi is all about. So we already had chapter 1 is asking Yosef to bury him in Egypt. Chapter 2 is now having this dialogue, basically transferring certain rights to Yosef that are going to go to his sons Menashe and Ephraim. Okay. Again, notice it starts with vayaged li Yaakov. Yaakov is told that Yosef is on his way. Again, we don't know who's doing all this dialogue. The Torah doesn't tell us who told Yosef he's ill, who told him that Yosef is coming. But again, notice not vayechi Yaakov, it's vayechi Yisrael. Yisrael is the one who strengthens himself and sits up in bed. Again, the presumption is that he was lying in bed. He gathers up enough energy to sit up. And again, Midrashim want to say that the reason that the Torah emphasizes this is to show that even though he's the father of the second in command, he still shows deference to Yosef as the second in command. That's why he sits up rather than having this whole audience while he's lying down. Okay. Yaakov, now again, I'm going to go to whatever, I always forget which is right, which is left on is you're seeing it. But on the right side is parshat vayechi. The left side is what Yaakov is flashing back to in parshat vayishlach, okay, which is chapter Lamed Hey in Bereshit. Now again, notice it was Yisrael who set up, but it's Yaakov who speaks to Yosef. This is one that doesn't seem to fit the mold. Because in general, the Parshim want to say that Yisrael focuses on Yaakov's role as the leader of the nation, as when it's focusing on Am Yisrael and its future, or something that relating to Yaakov when he's more spiritual as opposed to his physical. Here, this doesn't seem to fit because here Yaakov is talking to Yosef about the blessing Hashem gave him and how that translates into the future of the Jewish people. I would have expected it to say Vayomer Yisrael El Yosef, but it says Vayomer Yaakov. Okay. Now he says Hashem in the name of Kel Shakai, near Eli appeared to me Beluz B'Eretz Canaan, Vayivarach Oti, and he gave me this blessing. And you see if the flashback first says Vayivarach Oto, God appears to Yaakov as he's on his way home from Lavan, and he gives him this blessing. And the blessing he gives him, by the way, is that he's going to change his name from Yaakov to Yisrael. Notice that he's not going to call your name Yaakov, he'll call it Yisrael. But then after he changes his name, he tells him the following. And this I'm reading from the flashback side. God says, I need Kel Shakai, I am a Kel Shakai, which we had above. Hooray, Urvei, be fruitful and multiply. Goy, another nation, Ukahal Goyim, and a congregation of nations, Yemi Mecca, will come forth from you. Now remember, at this point, he's already got 11 sons and 1 daughter. Okay, so he's been pretty fruitful and multiplied already. But God says, no, you're going to be more fruitful and more multiplied. And you're going to have a goy, a nation, ukahal goyim, and at least 2 more nations are all going to come forth from you. And they'll be kings. And then he promises the land. The land that I promised Am Yisrael is going to go to you. And now he paraphrases that in his message to Yosef by saying, I, God, will allow you to become fruitful and multiply. I'm going to make you a kahal amim. But notice he doesn't mention I'm going to make you a goyu kahal amim. He only mentions the kahal goyim, where he says he changes kahal goyim to kahal amim. V'natati d'oretz azot, in this land I'm going to give as we see. Now, the Parshanim say that the reason Yaakov leaves out the word goy from this message of God is because Yaakov figures, wait a minute, Goy, I'm going to have one more. I had another child. That was Binyamin after God gave me this message. Shortly thereafter, by the way, is when Binyamin is born. But Yaakov says, wait a minute, he promised me 2 more nations after that. And that's really the prelude to what he's going to say. So Yaakov says to Yosef, I understood from this message from God that I was going to have 2 more sons, or 2 more people who are going to be equal to my sons. And that's why he now says, therefore, now, your 2 sons who were born while they were in Egypt, before I got here, Lihaim, they are me. Oh, I forgot Ephraim and Manasseh. I forgot to highlight Ephraim and Manasseh. What happens when you... Ephraim and Manasseh will be like Reuben and Shimon. Just like Reuben and Shimon are tribes, so too Ephraim and Manasseh will each be their own tribe. There won't be a tribe of Yosef. There'll be 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. If you now have more children, they will still be part. They will not be their own Shevet. They will not be Shevet Yosef. They will be either part of Manasseh or part of Ephraim. By the way, we have nowhere recorded that Yosef had any more children, but Yaakov wants to make sure he covers all his bases, that he doesn't, so that there's no complaint later on. Hey, wait, Manasseh and Ephraim got to be tribes. Why don't I, Mr. Son number 3, whoever I might be, get to be a tribe? Right, so Yaakov covers his base. He said, God promised me 2 more, at least 2 more. I'm taking Ephraim and Manasseh as these are the next 2 tribes. Again, now, yes, David, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Just on first thought, the 2 sons he chooses, Reuben and
Shimon,
don't exactly seem the best choice of his sons.
That's an interesting comment. I think what Yaakov is saying, hey, these are my first 2 sons. They are listed. I'm listing them, and they're the first 2. These are your first 2. They are the equivalent in terms of how they are to be perceived in their thing. You're right. Well, but I think there was, look, to be honest, if we go through the sons, there was no way that Yaakov could have picked 2 consecutive sons that would have conveyed the message. I think. I mean, I was going to say like you and Binyamin, or there are no other pair of sons. The reason he's picking Reuben and Shimon is they're the first 2, and these are your first 2. But you're right. On the other hand, I mean, each of the tribes in their own right, while there may have been some challenges they went through, ultimately all, as we saw, they're all reconciled at the end, and they all become part of the family. It's not like Reuben and Shimon get thrown out, like Esau gets thrown out, or Yishmael gets thrown out. So they're still part of the family, of the clan. So I think it's in the sense of, these are my first 2, these are your first 2. I think it's more in that sense, not necessarily that that just like Reuben and Shimon were my 2 most prized sons. I don't know that Yaakov had. I mean, obviously we all know that Yaakov's favorite clearly seemed to have been Yosef. I mean, the Torah tells us that. And after Yosef, clearly Binyamin. So, but I don't think he was going to say, like you and Binyamin. I don't think Yaakov had that intent. I think it was just simply saying that just like Reuben and Shimon are tribes, these 2 are going to be tribes. I think that's more the intent. Okay. Okay. Now comes the verse in this whole story that is totally out of place. And now Yaakov again, he's in the middle. He's just said, "I'm going to bless your 2 sons." I'm going to skip pasuk Zion just for 1 minute. And then after in verse Chad, it says, suddenly he sees the children, and the story picks up with Yaakov interacting with Manasseh and Ephraim and Yosef. But there's, as I said, there's this one verse in the middle, completely out of place here. And while I was coming home from Padan, from Lavan, Rachel died on the way. A certain distance from Ephrat. And I buried her there in Ephrat, which is Beit Lechem. And by the way, if you look this flashback, this is again flashback to the burial of Rachel. Very similar words by Istumi Beit El. Yaakov is traveling after he's gotten this promise from God that he's going to be fruitful and multiply, and And Vayechi Kifrat Haaretz Lo Efrat. He was almost at Efrat, at this place called Efrat. He had a little distance to go, whatever Kifrat Eretz is. And then Rachel gives birth, and she had problems with her childbirth. She dies. Notice I skipped a few pasukim where it talks about the different names they give Binyamin. But Tikaver derech Efrat hi Beit Lechem. She's buried in the way to Efrat, which is Beit Lechem. And Yaakov makes a matzeva. He pours a monument on Matzeh Rachel, which is Kvor Rachel Ad Hayom. The commentaries are baffled by why this verse is here. What is it doing here? And as a matter of fact, when I talked to you about the intermingling of the stories, this verse seems to be the driving force between commentators were saying that there's something wrong with this pasuk. It really should have been in the last chapter where Yaakov is asking Yosef to bury him in Eretz Yisrael. And Yosef says, well, wait a minute, you didn't bring my mom to Machpelah, why should I schlep you to Machpelah? But that's what the Parshanim want to say, that Yaakov is explaining to Yosef, I couldn't, I had a whole family entourage, we were all there, I had to bury her there. And the Midrash has a whole drush on this pasuk, based on the pasukim in Yirmiyahu. We know that Yirmiyahu tells us, as the Jews were going into exile, Kol Bravan Yishma, Rachel comes out from Kever Rachel as the exiles from the first temple from the destruction of the first temple are passing Kever Rachel and davens on their behalf. It's a wonderful, wonderful midrash based on that pasuk. And Yaakov says, I had to bury there. Hashem told me that where she had to be buried. It still doesn't answer why it's placed here in the middle of this story. And so that's why it seems to me, and again, just a suggestion, that's why you'll notice, as I said, it's juxtaposed to the previous flashback, both here and in the original story. And I think that's why it's here. The reason it's here is because Yaakov is almost reminiscing back to that flashback where God spoke to him. Oh yeah, what happened right after that? Binyamin was born and I buried Rachel. Okay, because he's going off on this, he's saying, this is, as I said, it's completely going off on a tangent. Now, I don't remember who, but I saw one of the Parshanim suggests that the reason this is here is because Yaakov, at this point, when he's about to bless Menashe and Ephraim, he suddenly has this revelation that, oh my gosh, you know what? Yosef was only 17 when he left home. I'm talking about burial, and obviously the reason I want to know where people know where I'm buried is so that ultimately my descendants or my children can come to my kever, to offer tefillot, whatever we do at a kever, to know where I'm buried. And you know what? I don't even remember if Yosef ever really knew. I mean, how old was he when his mother died? He was 7, 8 years old. Does he even remember where she was buried? And he suddenly, as part of this whole flashback and this whole mental process he's going through, suddenly remembers about the burial of Rachel and mentions it to Yosef in the presence of the grandchildren who never even met their grandmother, because she was dead long before Yosef got to Egypt. So again, why it's here, I don't know. But it seems to, again, there are those who want to suggest that this shows that the Torah wasn't all divinely inspired. It was edited by a bunch of editors, and this was stuck in the wrong story in the wrong place. But it is the Parshanim have to try to struggle to understand why this ended up here. And I think, as I said, I think it's pretty interesting that it's two flashbacks that Yaakov's having, both flashing back to almost the same point in the Torah in his life, where this Hashem blesses him, he travels, and Rachel dies, and she's buried. So, yes, David. Yes.
Maybe why on your for this, but
Right, his love for Rachel is transferred to Yosef. Okay.
And that continues, but this is sort of part of the rationale.
So the rationale for giving them the bracha, David has suggested the rationale for giving them the bracha is because Rachel died and I didn't have her to lavish all this love on, so I'm giving it to her grandsons who she never had the chance to meet. It's a possibility, but he doesn't have to mention that where she's buried. He could have just said, there were other ways he could have said that. You should know Rachel was my most beloved wife. That's why I'm giving her grandchildren this wonderful privilege. But I don't know. It seems a very, back behind the back, sort of a very strange way to. But I think he wants to mention Rachel in front of her grandchildren, who we don't have any idea what relationship they had. Rabbi. Yaakov understands he's on his deathbed, or close to it.
But because of the age, and perhaps it's just a thought that comes into it, that has no rationale, but it's part of his psyche.
It's part of his thought process.
Not even thought process, but just a human reaction at the time of death. You think of
Other deaths.
Why?
Okay. The rabbi wants to suggest that this is Yaakov processing the fact that he's close to death and thinking about other deaths that he's been through. And I mean, that's interesting, because later on at the end of the chapter, where he actually talks to all the sons, his last command to the children is what he repeats what he said to Yosef, bury me in Machpelah. And there he goes to the whole description of Machpelah. That's where Avram is buried. That's where Sarah is buried. That's where Rivka is buried. Yitzchak's buried. That's where I buried Leah. So that clearly, again, might be why here he's mentioning Rachel sort of on the side, in front of her descendants, rather than doing it in front of all of the descendants. So that's a possibility. Okay. So we move on after, as I said, this seems completely out of place, but again, I think it's Yaakov. Yaakov is going through this whole process, and this is just something that hit his mind. Okay, now we're going to switch to a different two columns. We're going back and forth when Yaakov interacting with Yosef now. Again, notice it's now Vayar Yisrael. We've left Yaakov behind. It's now Yisrael. Suddenly he sees Yosef and he asks who they are. Yosef says, "They're my children. That God has given me." And Yaakov then answers, "Bring me to me, because I want to give them a bracha." Vayagesh otame love. I'm sorry. Again, notice it's Yisrael now. His eyes, again, not great. Same thing we had with Yitzchak. Yaakov's eyes suddenly they're heavy from his age. Lo yuchal lirot, he couldn't see clearly. So therefore, Vayagesh otame love. Yosef brings them close to Yaakov, and they both hug and kiss him. And then again, notice as I said, throughout this, he's going to be Yisrael. Yisrael says to Yosef, again, as we've commented a number of times, Yaakov has this fixation. I saw your face again. And God, not only did he allow me to see your face again, he's also shown me your children's. Yosef moves them, takes them off of Yaakov's lap or next to him, and they bow down, and they bow down to him, and he bows down to him. And Yosef takes them and brings them now to his father. Again, stands them up and places them and positions them in front of their father. He puts Ephraim on his right, which is his father's left. He places Manasseh on his left, which is Yaakov's right. And again, the Torah focuses, this is a very important part. The whole Torah wants to focus on this. And then he pushes them forward, right, so they're right next to the bed where Yaakov is sitting. Then, of course, we know the famous story. Yaakov takes his right hand, puts it to the left side on Ephraim's head, takes his left hand, puts it on top of Manasseh, who's on the right side. He switches his arms, Ki Manasseh B'char, because Manasseh was the firstborn. So you would have thought he'd get the right hand, Ephraim would get the left hand. No, he put it this way and this way. Now, before he does that, all he's done is he's done this, and then he gives Yosef a bracha, the famous bracha, Hamalach Hagoel Oti. He says, this angel that's always been around, been keeping an eye on me, God should watch over you, and bless Vivarechet Hanarim. He should bless these two children of yours. V'karishram Shmi B'Shem Osai. They should be blessed with my parents' name, Avram Yitzchak, and V'Yidkul Arov B'Kerev Haaretz, and they should multiply in the midst of the land. The land. Notice he doesn't say Eretz Yisrael. He doesn't say Eretz Yisrael. He said the land. In other words, they should have large families. And the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, relatively, they were probably in the middle of the pack. They weren't the largest, they weren't the smallest. Although during the 40 years they were in the desert, I think Manasseh has one of the largest growth rates of all the tribes during the 40 years between the two census. Okay. We know that Yosef is upset now that his father put his right hand on Ephraim's hand, and he says, "Wait a minute, Dad. This is Manasseh is the firstborn. That's why I put him on your right." And Yaakov says, "I know, not to worry. He'll be okay. He'll do fine. But his brother will be his younger brother is going to be greater, and his descendants will be world renowned." Medrash wants to tell us this refers to Yoshua because Yoshua was known throughout the world. Now, if I were to ask you today, what was it that made Yoshua world now? What does the people know Yoshua by? Anybody? What is Yoshua most well known for? Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, right?
Jericho, yeah.
Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, right? When the walls came tumbling down. Well, they didn't come tumbling down, they sank into the earth, but that's a whole different story. But Rashi and the Medrash doesn't say that they'll be known because of Battle of Jericho. Why was Yoshua world renowned? Because he screwed up everybody's clocks by stopping the sun in its tracks for a whole day, for a period of whether it's 12 hours or 24 hours. Midrashim and Yoshua argue about that. When he's fighting in Givon, he tells the Shemesh to stop, and the moon, hold your places, stay where you are, because we're in the middle of a war here, and we need the light. We need daylight to finish this battle. But the fact is, in any case, it's Yoshua who comes from the tribe of Ephraim, who at least most of the parshanim say that this verse is referring to. And yet, if you study the story, the history of the first temple period, when each of the tribes still maintained their tribal identity as well as being part of Yisrael, Ephraim clearly plays a much larger role than Manasseh does. Even though Manasseh has leaders to come from Manasseh, Ephraim is one of the driving tribes in the northern kingdom throughout the entire period. So it's not understatement to say that Ephraim was outstripped Manasseh in terms of what they accomplished. Okay. By the way, the Midrashim want to build a whole story about who Manasseh and Ephraim were. The Medrash wants to say that Ephraim was the one who used to go and learn Torah with Yaakov, while Manasseh was the one who used to be his father's right-hand man in running the government. So therefore, he gives the bigger bracha to Ephraim, the Torah scholar. Manasseh is the one who's busy running the country. But you need both skills. I think Yaakov recognizes that. Perhaps after his father thought the same thing with him and Esav, and it didn't work out that way. Maybe he realizes, I guess we do need all of these different skills, both political skill, religious skill, Torah skills, etc. So he gives them this bracha, and of course, the bracha that of course we're well known is that throughout history, Yisrael, the Jewish people, will bless their children, saying, which is the bracha we all give our children to this very day. And it's interesting because somebody asked me, why do girls get Sarah Rivka Rachel? Why don't we say Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov? And the answer is because Yaakov said the bracha we're going to give them is Ephraim and Manasseh. And the question we all have to answer is why. Okay, and the rest of the chapters, then Yaakov says to Yosef, I'm going to die, and I'm giving you this specific gift that I took from the Amori B'charbi B'kashti, which has all sorts of different interpretations that we don't want to go into. I don't want to go into tonight, but I want to focus at this point for the last couple of minutes on why is it that this story is placed here, and why is it that Yaakov picks these two as being the ones that should get this bracha, aside from the fact that Yosef is his favorite son. Okay, so he gives them a bracha. We understand why he elevates them to the status of tribes. That I can understand, because again, Yosef is his favorite son, Rachel is his favorite wife. We understand where Manasseh and Ephraim are coming from, but why this bracha of Yasim Cholchim K'Ephraim Manasseh? That throughout history our children should aspire to be Manasseh and Ephraim. Why shouldn't they aspire to be Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, David? Why Ephraim and Manasseh? So there are a number of possibilities offered. by the commentaries. One that I think is the most, perhaps one of the most obvious, is the fact that the book of Bereshit has been all about sibling rivalry. Every story in Bereshit, every generation in Bereshit, we had brothers, and there was lots of challenges of the brothers getting along together. Here we have a brother being passed over in favor of his younger brother, and we don't find, now we find Yosef was a little disappointed that Yaakov did this, but Menashe doesn't say anything. Now, where do we don't find anywhere Menashe say, I'm gonna kill Ephraim because he got the better bracha, like we have with Asa. Why doesn't that happen? So we sense already that, and with this, basically, this is one of the last chapters of the book of Bereshit, we sense already that perhaps Bereshit is the story of all the problems that happen when we cannot learn to get along with each other. And Ephraim and Menashe, the reason we bless our children to be like Ephraim and Menashe, not like anybody else in history, is because they are the first two brothers to set the pace, to set the tone for how we can live together in peace, in harmony, in a way that we can move forward. And I think that is the key lesson, key takeaway from the book of Bereshit, that a lot of the problems here are family problems, are whether it's spouses having challenges with children not getting along together. If we can aspire to be Ephraim and Menashe, who showed us how to live together peacefully, work together, then we're okay. Then we can survive as a nation. That's one possible school of thought as for why Ephraim and Menashe specifically are picked for this, not just one-time bracha, but throughout history bracha, that if we aspire to be like Menashe and Ephraim, that was what they accomplished. That's one opinion. The second is, yes, David. Who is it, David?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
still
yeah.
it's still a Torah mitzvah, one of the 630 mitzvahs, that the firstborn gets a double portion.
Yes, in terms of financial proceeds, yes, the firstborn gets a double portion of the estate, as if there were two. So if there are 4 sons, he gets 2/5, and the other 3 get the other 3/5. Yes, that's correct. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah. Now, again, in this case, as I said, this is the blessing here really is that each of these are being elevated to tribes, and that Ephraim is being placed before Menashe. And the blessing, as I said, it's not a trivial thing that we say to our children, every time we give a bracha. I don't think that's a trivial thing. I think that's a very important and a significant thing that Yaakov is teaching us, that these two, are the role models that we should be aspiring to live by, according to that. That's what I'm saying, okay? So that's one perspective. The other perspective that I've seen in a number of places is the fact that Ephraim and Menashe are the first children, Jewish children, who are raised as Jewish children outside of Eretz Yisrael. And not only that, they are raised in they could have selected to become Egyptian royalty. Their father was the number 2 guy to Paro. They could have had any position they wanted or chose in Egyptian society, and they chose to remember that they were not part of Egyptian society and to live as Jews. At least that's the impression that we get from what we read about Ephraim and Menashe, that I can't imagine Yaakov would have given this bracha to his 2 grandchildren had they been, in Egyptian high society. And so that's the second reason given by commentators why Ephraim and Menashe specifically are picked for this specific bracha, that they are, again, representative of how a Jew has to live when he's living outside of Eretz Yisrael, when he's living in a alien culture. And that is what we bless our children with when we say that you should be strong enough to be able to withstand the societal pressure of a dominant culture, because it is very, very challenging. Perhaps the most, it's certainly more challenging than growing up in a culture where you're surrounded by the predominant culture, being a Jewish culture. Culture in certain places is pervasive, especially in the formative years, whether it's in school, whether it's in your chugim, whatever you're doing, you want to be, quote, one of the guys. So if all of the guys are non-Jewish and you happen to be the only Jewish guy you want to blend in. So for us to be able to bless our children, that you should have the strength of character that Ephraim and Manasseh had to be able to withstand that dominant culture, that is what Yaakov is trying to convey to us. And that's why this has been the generational blessing of the Jewish people. So either of those, I find both of those very, very powerful reasons. I'm sure there are other reasons that are suggested. Those are the two that I've seen the most prevalent, and both of those, to me, seem to be very, very persuasive reasons why we would pick Ephraim and Asher rather than Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, because it's just a very, very powerful statement. So, as I said, so I think if we go through these two different stories of Yaakov and Yosef, the legacy that Yaakov is trying to leave as he is on his deathbed, and if you go through the blessings he gives the tribes and the less message he gives to them at the end, which is very similar, is first and foremost, Egypt is not our home. When we are out of Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't matter whether it's Egypt or Bavel or America or Canada or wherever it might be, or England. We have to remember that our home is Eretz Yisrael. I didn't make it back while I was alive. I want to at least make it back while, after I'm dead. That message is the message Yaakov gives Yosef, and Yosef takes it to heart because, as I said, at the end of the parsha, he gives the same message forward. We have to remember that Egypt is not our home. We're only here temporarily. Secondly, as I said, I think the importance of learning that Achdut Yisrael, whether it's brothers or it's families or it's extended families, is the key to our survival as the Jewish people. That if we can't get along with each other, there's no way we're going to get along with anybody else, or anybody else is going to get along with us or have any respect for us. And thirdly, that we have to maintain our identity. No matter what exile and what trials and tribulations we go through, we have to maintain our Jewish identity, our Jewish culture, despite the pervasive culture of the host country we may be in. And we lose that, we risk losing our identity if we cannot withstand the pervasive dominant culture. So those, I think, are very powerful lessons, and I hope that enough people will learn them and come back home and continue to help Torah and mitzvah grow here so that we can be Zofer to Gula Shlema. Thank you all for joining. I open the floor up to comments, questions, and feedback at this point. Anybody? Any comments, feedbacks on the, okay. Everyone have a wonderful week. And Bez Shem will try again next week with a new book and a new story. Chazak, chazak, chazak. So have a good rest of the week and be well, everybody. Till next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.